The survival of the men stranded after the loss of their ship did not alter the geography of the Southern Ocean, nor did it change the conditions that define it. Ice continued to drift. Weather followed its established patterns. Elephant Island remained uninhabited and rarely approached. What endured instead was a record of sustained adaptation. The events demonstrated how survival in extreme environments depends less on singular acts than on prolonged management of limited resources, structure, and restraint. Decisions were made without expectation of recognition and carried out without assurance of success. In historical accounts, the episode is often summarized by its outcome. Yet its significance lies in the process rather than the result. Survival occurred not through conquest of the environment, but through accommodation to it. The men did not overcome the cold. They endured within it, long enough for circumstances beyond the island to intervene. Their experience remains a reference point for what controlled persistence can achieve under isolation. By late August 1916, the situation on Elephant Island had reached a steady but fragile equilibrium. The men who remained were alive, but their capacity to endure further decline was limited. Supplies were reduced to essential levels. Clothing had been repaired repeatedly. The shelters continued to hold, though they required constant attention. On August 30th, 1916, a small vessel appeared offshore. It did not approach quickly. Sea conditions dictated movement, and the coastline offered few places where a landing could be attempted safely. When the ship finally came close enough to be recognized, it was identified as a Chilean tugboat, the Yelcho. It had been dispatched following renewed efforts to reach the island after earlier attempts had failed due to ice and weather. The transfer from shore to ship was conducted without urgency. Men moved when directed, carrying what equipment they could manage. There was no rush. The process took time, governed by waves, footing, and fatigue. All remaining members of the group were brought aboard. No formal record describes celebration at the moment of rescue. Accounts note quietness and restraint. The men were weak, weathered, and accustomed to limitation. The immediate priority was warmth and rest. Medical assessment followed, but treatment options were basic. Within hours, Elephant Island receded from view. The land that had imposed survival through constraint returned to its previous state, unchanged by human presence. For the men leaving it behind, the period of isolation ended without ceremony. The outcome was survival, confirmed only by departure. As the weeks on Elephant Island extended, the effects of prolonged exposure became more apparent. The environment did not worsen dramatically, but it did not improve. Cold remained constant. Wind persisted. The landscape offered no new resources beyond those already identified. What changed was the condition of the men living within it. Diet, though sufficient to prevent immediate starvation, lacked variety. Fresh meat was available only when hunting succeeded, and these opportunities were uneven. Periods passed when seals did not appear along the shore. During those times, rations were reduced, weight loss became visible, energy declined. Tasks that had once been routine required greater effort. Health issues accumulated gradually, minor injuries healed slowly. Gum inflammation and joint stiffness appeared in some men, likely linked to nutritional imbalance. Frostbite scars hardened skin and reduced dexterity. Medical treatment was limited to observation, rest when possible, and the careful allocation of food. There were no interventions beyond this. Psychological strain increased alongside physical decline. The confined shelters offered little separation. Privacy did not exist. Sleep was frequently interrupted by weather or the need to adjust. Coverings as snow shifted. Time lost clarity. Days followed one another without distinct markers. The absence of external contact reinforced uncertainty. Attempts to prepare for departure continued, but progress was constrained. Boat repairs advanced slowly due to limited materials and reduced strength. Weather windows were narrow and unpredictable. Any plan depended on conditions aligning precisely, something that could not be controlled. Deaths did occur during this period, though not all were directly attributable to exposure alone. Illness and long-term strain contributed. Each loss reduced the group's capacity and altered its balance. The response to death was restrained. There were no ceremonies beyond necessity. Bodies were dealt with according to circumstance and environment, with attention focused on those still alive. Despite these pressures, the structure established earlier remained largely intact. Duties were still assigned, meals were still shared. Records were still kept when possible. This adherence to routine was not a solution, but it slowed deterioration. It preserved decision-making capacity at a time when exhaustion threatened to erode it. Waiting became the dominant condition. It was not passive, but it was unavoidable. Every day without change reinforced the reality that survival depended on events beyond the island itself. The men had done what could be done locally. The next outcome would arrive from elsewhere, or not at all. With the loss of the ship, the expedition entered a different phase, one defined not by travel, but by maintenance. The men were no longer moving toward a destination. Their immediate concern became stability, finding ways to exist on a surface that was never still. The ice on which they stood was not a single solid mass. It consisted of large floes pressed together, separated by cracks that opened and closed without warning. Snow covered most surfaces, concealing fractures beneath. Movement had to be measured. Heavy loads were distributed carefully. Camps were arranged with the expectation that relocation might be required at short notice. The first shelters were improvised from tents and salvaged materials. Canvas was stretched over sleds and boats. Snow blocks were cut and stacked where windbreaks were needed. The goal was not comfort, but insulation and predictability. Interior temperatures remained below freezing, but the structures reduced exposure to wind, which posed the greatest immediate risk. Food management became systematic. Rations originally intended for sledging were now the primary source of calories. These were supplemented by hunting. Seals were taken when possible, providing meat and blubber. The meat offered protein and fat. The blubber served as fuel. It burned slowly, producing light and heat inside enclosed spaces. Consumption was recorded and regulated to prevent depletion. Daily routines emerged quickly. Meals were prepared at fixed times. Watches were kept to monitor ice conditions and weather changes. Equipment was checked and repaired repeatedly, even when it appeared functional. Clothing was dried when conditions allowed, then worn again. The repetition of these tasks created a structure that helped offset uncertainty. Physical health varied among the group. Some men adapted well to the cold and limited diet. Others showed signs of fatigue and weight loss. Frostbite was a constant concern, particularly during periods of exposure. Injuries were treated with basic medical supplies salvaged from the ship, but options were limited. Prevention became the primary strategy. As weeks passed, the ice began to drift northward. The movement was slow but measurable. This drift offered a possibility, eventual contact with land. At the same time, it introduced new risks. Pressure ridges formed without warning. Open water appeared and closed again. Camps were repositioned multiple times to avoid unstable areas. When land was finally sighted, it was approached cautiously. The ice between the floes and the shoreline was fragmented. Boats were used to cross short stretches of water, hauled over ice where possible. After several attempts, the men reached a narrow strip of land, later identified as Elephant Island. The landing was not orderly. Conditions dictated timing, and the boats were brought ashore where the sea permitted. The island offered limited relief. It was uninhabited, steep, and exposed. There was little flat ground. Snow accumulated unevenly. Rock faces rose directly from the shore. Despite these limitations, the land provided something the ice could not: relative stability. Camps could be established without constant relocation. Shelter construction resumed immediately. The boats were inverted and propped with stone, creating low enclosures. Snow and canvas were packed around the edges to seal gaps. Inside, space was restricted. Men slept close together to conserve heat. Condensation froze on interior surfaces, requiring regular clearing to prevent collapse. Food acquisition continued along the shore. Seals and penguins were present in limited numbers. Hunting was conducted methodically, avoiding unnecessary exertion. Nothing was wasted. Bones were used as supports. Skins were repurposed for insulation. Blubber remained essential for fuel. Leadership focused on discipline rather than optimism. Schedules were maintained. Duties were assigned and rotated. Conflicts were managed quietly, without formal proceedings. The aim was to preserve cohesion. Isolation amplified minor tensions, and unchecked disputes could compromise survival. Communication with the outside world was impossible. No rescue was expected without direct action. This reality shaped planning. Boats were repaired and reinforced. Navigation instruments were checked. Clothing was modified for extended exposure. These preparations occurred alongside daily survival tasks, stretching limited resources and attention. Time was measured indirectly. Weather patterns shifted gradually. Daylight lengthened and shortened. The physical condition of the group provided another measure as weight fluctuated and endurance changed. Records were kept where possible, though precision diminished as materials wore out. Throughout this period, survival depended less on individual strength than on collective management. No single task ensured continuation. Instead, a series of controlled actions, repeated daily, created a margin between life and failure. The environment remained unchanged, but the group adapted its presence within it. The routine did not eliminate uncertainty, it only contained it. As conditions persisted, the strain of waiting became as significant as cold or hunger. By early 1915, the seasonal patterns the expedition had relied upon failed to appear. The ice surrounding the ship did not thin with time. Instead, it thickened and compressed. Pressure ridges formed nearby, their surfaces breaking into sharp angles as large sheets collided. The vessel no longer drifted freely. It was held in place, fixed within a moving field that responded only to temperature and wind. The crew continued daily maintenance as long as conditions allowed. Snow was cleared from the deck, rigging was checked, interior spaces were kept functional. These routines served practical needs, but they also imposed order on a situation that was becoming increasingly constrained. The ship remained upright. Its hull showed no immediate signs of failure. As winter approached, daylight shortened. Temperatures dropped further. The surrounding ice expanded and contracted in slow cycles, each movement transferring force into the ship's sides. The design of the hull initially worked as intended. Pressure lifted the vessel slightly rather than splitting it. For a time, this movement was controlled and survivable. That balance did not last. In October 1915, the ice began to close with greater force. Audible sounds accompanied the pressure. Timbers creaked. Internal supports shifted. Water seeped in, where seams were strained. Pumps were operated regularly, but the effort became constant rather than occasional. The ship's structure, built for resistance but not permanence within solid ice, was being tested beyond its limits. Eventually, the hull began to deform visibly. Planks bent inward. The deck buckled in sections. Machinery inside was displaced, as the frame lost its shape. The crew removed essential supplies while access remained possible, carrying food, tools, and boats onto the ice nearby. This work was deliberate and controlled. There was no sudden evacuation, only a gradual transfer from one form of shelter to another. On November 21, 1915, the ship was abandoned. Shortly afterward, the pressure exceeded what the structure could absorb. The hull fractured. Water filled the interior. The vessel settled unevenly, then sank beneath the ice surface. What had served as transport, shelter, and boundary between the crew and the environment disappeared completely. The men were left standing on the ice with what they had salvaged. There was no immediate land in sight. The surface beneath them was unstable, subject to movement and breakup. Their isolation was now absolute. The option of retreat no longer existed. From this point forward, survival would depend entirely on adaptation outside the ship. The journey that led into the southern ice began with intent rather than accident. In the early years of the 20th century, Antarctica remained largely untraveled. Large portions of its interior were unmapped. Expeditions from several nations were attempting to reach farther inland, driven by geographic curiosity, national interest, and the prevailing belief that the continent still held definable achievements. Crossing it from one coast to another remained unrealized. The expedition that would later be defined by survival rather than discovery departed in 1914. Its purpose was ambitious but clearly stated: to attempt a transcontinental crossing of Antarctica via the South Pole. The plan involved landing on one side of the continent, traversing the interior with sled teams, and emerging on the opposite coast, where a supporting ship would retrieve the crossing party. The vessel selected for the task was a wooden sailing ship reinforced for ice. It was not large, but it was designed specifically for polar travel. Its hull had been built to withstand pressure by flexing rather than resisting outright. This design had proven effective in previous Arctic voyages, where ships were often forced upward by encroaching ice instead of being crushed by it. The men aboard represented a range of backgrounds. Some were experienced polar travelers. Others were sailors accustomed to long voyages. There were scientists tasked with collecting data on weather, ice, and wildlife. There were also individuals whose primary roles involved maintaining equipment, managing animals, and handling daily operations aboard the ship. Not all were specialists, but most had been selected for adaptability rather than narrow expertise. Leadership was centralized. Decisions flowed from a single authority, supported by officers who managed navigation, logistics, and discipline. This structure was typical of expeditions of the period, where isolation required clear chains of command. Once the ship entered Antarctic waters, outside assistance would be non-existent. Every choice would have consequences that could not be corrected quickly. Supplies reflected expectations of difficulty but not catastrophe. Food, fuel, and equipment had been loaded for an extended journey, including sledging rations, tents, clothing, and tools. Dogs were carried for hauling. Small boats were stored aboard in case landings or emergency movements became necessary. The ship itself was the primary shelter, workspace, and means of transport. As the expedition moved south, progress slowed. Sea ice appeared earlier than anticipated. Pack ice closed in around the vessel, limiting maneuverability. Navigation required patience rather than speed. The ship advanced when openings appeared and waited when they did not. This pattern was not unusual in polar travel and did not initially signal failure. Over time, however, the ice ceased to shift in expected ways. Seasonal changes did not loosen its hold. The ship's movement became increasingly restricted. What had been a voyage with a defined objective gradually transformed into prolonged waiting. The men adapted their routines to life aboard a stationary vessel, maintaining discipline and structure while conditions outside remained largely unchanged. At this stage, the expedition was still intact. The ship remained habitable. Supplies were sufficient. Communication among the crew continued as planned. There was no immediate danger, only delay. Yet the longer the ice refused to release its grip, the more limited the available options became. The journey forward was no longer progressing, and the possibility of remaining in place began to replace the original intent of crossing the continent. This shift marked the quiet beginning of a situation that would later remove choice altogether. At the southern margins of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans, the sea narrows into colder latitudes. Here, the water carries fragments of ice even in summer. Wind moves without obstruction, shaped by distance rather than terrain. The sky often appears low, its color changing slowly over long hours. Light arrives at shallow angles. Darkness, when it comes, is prolonged. The land in this region is limited and fragmented. Small islands break the surface of the ocean, their coastlines sharp and exposed. Rock faces rise directly from the water. Snow gathers where it can hold. Ice fills the spaces in between. There are no trees. There is no soil in the usual sense. What life exists does so close to the shore, dependent on the sea rather than the land. These islands sit far from established routes. They are not destinations. They offer no natural harbors and little shelter. Weather arrives without warning, often remaining for days. When conditions worsen, the ocean becomes the defining presence, dictating movement and limiting vision. Distance loses meaning. Direction becomes difficult to judge. For most of history, these places were unrecorded or inaccurately mapped. There, names appeared late on charts, sometimes misplaced, sometimes misspelled. Even after they were known, few had reason to approach them. They held no resources worth extracting and offered no advantage to those passing through. In this environment, survival is not shaped by sudden danger, but by exposure over time. Cold acts gradually. Isolation accumulates. The landscape does not change to accommodate human presence. It remains indifferent, governed by weather, ice, and the slow movement of the sea. It was into this setting that a group of men would eventually arrive, not by design, but by circumstance.